Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to the Soldiers of Cinema podcast. As always, I'm Clark Coffey, and with me, as always, is Mr. Cullen McFater. What's going on, Cullen?
Hello, I'm good. How are you? I heard you had a little bit of a crazy day, didn't you, down in SoCal?
Well, I mean, I don't know if I would call it crazy, but it was just annoying. I had, it doesn't rain here very often. We'll go, like 9-10 months with no rain. So, all the while, you're thinking, there's no problems with my roof. Everything's fine. And then when it does finally rain once, then your roof proves you wrong. And so I had just a really minor, super minor leak that didn't hurt anything in the house, but I wanted to take care of it quick before it did hurt anything. So, yeah, I got to wake up bright and early this morning, forego my sleeping in late on a Saturday. And I had to deal with contractors walking around on my roof and making a mess on my porch and just generally running amok. So,
yes,
but other than that, everything's okay. I'm
nice.
Happy to be recording our 62nd episode. And which is going to be a discussion of your pick, which I was pretty surprised about, A Bridge Too Far from 1977.
Mm-hmm.
And apparently this is like one of your favorite films from childhood, which...
Yes, yeah, this was a huge, huge movie for me when I was a kid.
Which I'm like amazed by, man, because I mean, this would even be old for me, right? I mean, well, I get it's like I was born in 76, so I would have been a year old. And I get there are a lot of 70s films that I grew up on because, of course, they were, years later played on TV, and films like Rocky and that kind of stuff were huge for me. But I'm surprised that a film from 77 would be on your list of big movies as a child. So tell me about that, dude.
I'll tell the story. I'll regale
tell us the story.
You with the tale.
Tell us the tale.
So I remember being, and this is actually kind of funny because we did Butch Cassidy a while ago. I think it was
and
probably
that was a
in
big
the
film
30s.
for you. Yeah.
So it was that's like Butch Cassidy's my favorite movie of all time. Probably in terms of just movies that I could watch endlessly.
Yeah.
And so that was we probably did that episode about it over a year ago now, at least.
Yeah, wow.
And
it's been that long, huh?
I remember I have like this very distinct memory of I was probably only 6 years old. I think I was in grade 1, of walking into my dad's office, like his home at home, his little home office, and on his chair there was like this pile of I think they were VHS. I don't think they were DVDs. I think they were VHS. But he'd just gone out and bought these movies, and it was
they'd probably be VHS. I mean, if you're what year would this have been?
This would have been
place this for
2003. 2002,
oh, that could have been DVD.
Yeah,
it
would have been early in the kind of but I seem to remember they were VHS because I remember watching them in the basement, and I don't think we had a DVD player down there that early. But I remember, and so on the top of the pile was Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Mm-hmm. The middle of the pile was The Dirty Dozen.
Oh wow!
Which was another movie that I enjoyed. I haven't seen that in ages, but I remember
I saw that recently. Actually, I saw that just a few months ago. Yeah.
It's another World War II. A little bit more silly than this. And then on the bottom was A Bridge Too Far.
Now that had to have been like 4 VHS tapes, right? I mean,
it was a big. I remember it was a big pile, but he had gone. I can't remember where he probably got them. I don't know, some local store or something. But I just remember like looking at them with my brother, and I had no idea. I thought Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid was some kids movie because I thought the Sundance Kid was actually a child, like
an actual child.
Yeah, and so I was like, I don't really want to watch that. And I was always like, ever since probably since I was born, I was obsessed with the Second World War. Like it was like always my favorite era of history. And I played every World War II video game I could get my hands on as a kid. I was always out in, I lived quite close to like a big forest and was always out there with my friends, with army.
To digress just for a second.
Yeah, sure.
Do you remember? So because I feel like that this would have been about that era. So speaking of like World War II video games, what was the one? Was it like Call of Duty or something where they replicated the Saving Private Ryan?
Oh, yeah.
D-Day?
So I was actually going to mention that. Yeah.
Okay.
Medal of Honor was a franchise that after Saving Private Ryan, Spielberg created. Like he actually develop this video game. Of course, he
Oh,
didn't
really?
actually code it, but he was the lead creative on
I had no
making Medal
idea
of
of
Honor.
that.
And those were my favorite games as a kid. What's interesting about Medal of Honor is that, so yeah, the opening of, like, my favorite one was Medal of Honor Frontline, which I
Okay.
had, I think, on GameCube. And the opening of that is like a shot for shot, basically, of Saving Private Ryan, except, of course, you're playing it. But then it actually, Medal
I
of Honor
remember
goes
that.
you go into the Netherlands, and like one of the levels of the game is called Several Bridges Too Far, and it's like all of
No.
this stuff that's all about Operation Market Garden, and you're
Oh,
fighting in
wow.
the exact locations from this movie, and there's a ton of references to the movie. So
Oh, you
so that
had
was
to have
another
loved
way,
that.
like every just in and out, this movie was in my childhood. Like I remember watching it and just loving it, which again, this is a 3-hour movie, and I used
Yeah.
to force all of my friends at every sleepover to watch it, and they all liked it too somehow. And I would, again, like the theme song, I would have the theme song playing constantly and used it in all of my movies. And
That's awesome.
I always, I was just so into the Second World War. And
Now
I
tell
still am.
me.
Like I still am deeply fascinated by studying that.
Yeah, yeah,
But
I am too. Yeah, I am too. And just earlier this year, my wife and I spent 3 weeks in France, and
mhm.
she very generously and graciously allowed me to totally indulge my World War II like fantasy of
Mhm.
being at the Normandy beaches. And so I spent 3 or 4 days. She just like gave me to absorb all I could in France, World War II related, before we
Yeah.
went on to do other
And
things. But
that's oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, so I mean, so when I was watching it, for the first time ever, I'd never seen it before. I'm watching it last night in preparation for this, and in some ways, I could see like how this film would appeal to a young kid, right? Especially to a young boy. It's like there's some huge set pieces, and I mean, and we'll get into more of this later, but there's a lot of action, and I could totally see myself, and it's well done. I could totally see myself be, loving that, right? There's a lot of real planes and tanks and soldiers and battles and explosions. And I'm like, I totally could get it. But I am still kind of surprised that because there's a lot of the film where that's not what's going on.
Mhm. Mhm.
We follow a large number of characters. There's a lot of, it's a huge ensemble cast, and there's a lot of scenes that I would be surprised that a young kid would find interesting. So I'm kind of curious, like, if you could maybe try to kind of like I get that you love World War II, and I totally get the action stuff, but what do you think it was about this film that really stuck out to you? Like,
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's kind of two things. One is that true to life, the movie primarily takes place on like bright sunny days in just these meadows and
mm,
like those kind of European hedgerows and things like that. And um, that was somewhere that I didn't grow up in the countryside, but
hmm
where I grew up, there was a lot of nature and things like that, and again meadows and marshes and stuff like that. And so I think just the setting of the film reminded me a lot of where I grew up, and so it just kind of seemed
hmm,
accessible from like an imagination standpoint. That,
hmm.
like, again, me and my friends could watch this, get some like toy guns, and go out and recreate the moments and things like that.
Yeah,
And I think it's also just in scale is very grand. It's all like
it
these are
is.
real planes. These are real, people jumping out of planes, and even just
Yeah,
like the Spitfires are real. The tanks are real. So it feels, I think, very much like any, as a kid, you just watch these things, and the first thing you want to do is go build like a cardboard city and put a camera down beside it, and drive a toy tank through it and make it look like the city's coming down. So
yeah.
there's just that kind of, and then sort of a more personal connection, I suppose, is that my great uncle, my nana's brother, he fought in D-Day, and like landed on June 6th and all that in Normandy. And then
Oh,
he was, the Canadian forces were kind of tasked with primarily liberating the Netherlands.
mm,
And so they weren't actually involved in Market Garden,
mm.
because Market Garden was kind of a separate task. The Canadians were more near the coast. The Battle of the Scheldt was a big battle that they were involved in, and so he
Yeah.
was fighting in the Netherlands, pretty much at the time that this movie would be taking place. Again, not at Market Garden. So I think it was just also this like hearing his stories as a kid, and talking to him and my nana and kind of
Kind of
understanding
made it
that, like,
real.
yeah, exactly. And so there was this really, whereas I see something, Saving Private Ryan was also a big movie when I was a kid, but I think that to me was a little bit, it was, Saving Private Ryan's a lot smaller in scale in terms of just that it's about like kind of one group of guys going through the countryside.
Yeah.
And it's more dramatic. It's less sort of exciting in like in a fun movie way than this is.
Yeah.
So I think that was the thing, is that there's just this movie's, I was actually relatively concerned to rewatch this because it has been at least a decade since I've seen it. Probably over 15 years since I've seen it.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And
so how did you find the film now then? Like as an adult?
that's what I mean. And so I remember, like I loved it as a kid, and when I suggested it, I think the reason I suggested it was just because I was so curious to rewatch it. But I kind of, again, I was nervous. I was like going into it, and I was like, what if it's bad? What if it's like not?
yeah. You're like anxious.
It wasn't that critically successful, and it's not a very popular movie. There's definitely, it's overshadowed by a lot of other war movies. But I was really, really pleasantly surprised at how much I enjoyed it, and how like actually genuinely good in terms of just actual quality. I found it. Like I expected, if anything, to more like it just because of the nostalgia.
Yeah.
But like
you you feel like it held up.
The set pieces, the performances. There's things that are, again, a little bit sillier about it, like the fact that every single person you see is some huge name from the 70s. Like you name an actor that was in the 70s and around during the 70s. It's kind of crazy. They're in this, And you think that you've seen them all. Like it's like James Caan, Anthony Hopkins, Michael Caine, Laurence Olivier, and you go down the list, and then suddenly, like 3/4 of the movie, Robert Redford shows up, and you're like, where the hell was he?
And you're just like, what?
So yeah, and Sean Connery. I mean, it's like, and I was a big James Bond fan
Laurence
as a kid
Olivier.
Too.
Yeah.
So I think it was just so huge in scale that it just kind of like sucked me in it. And I actually, not to digress too much, but I went, when I was in the Netherlands, I made a very big point of visiting Arnhem. And seeing the bridge and all that. And so none of this movie is actually shot in Arnhem, just because Arnhem was flattened during the war. So it's all primarily more modern architecture than it would be. So they shot in nearby towns that actually look very, very stunningly similar to Arnhem. If I didn't know that they didn't shoot it there, I would have thought that they did. And then I biked from Arnhem to Oosterbeek, which is where the British headquarters were during the battle, that little house. And it's funny because every time I've met a Dutch person, and I even just on the trip that I did this summer when I went around the world, and I met a fair amount of people from the Netherlands, and every time I met them and they sort of said, "Oh, you've been to the Netherlands, like where have you been?" And I would mention Arnhem, and every one of them would be like, "Why the hell did you go to Arnhem?" Like it would be like going to New York and then taking an hour bus ride to like
Trenton,
Albuquerque,
New Jersey,
or not Albuquerque, Albany or something, right?
Yeah.
But it's a beautiful place. I mean, if you ever are in the Netherlands, I highly recommend going, not just for the history, but it's also a really, really beautiful part of the countryside. But no, it's so like really in terms of just the infusion of like my childhood, this movie was massive. Even just hearing the theme song again was like this
takes you back.
Yeah, it was, and it's such a fantastic theme song. And I mean, let's jump in, I guess, to like the more specific elements, unless you, I mean, what was your, I guess before we do that, what was your take when you saw it, and what do you think?
Yeah, sure. So first time I'd ever seen it, honestly, I don't even actually recall ever having even heard of the film, shockingly. So never had seen it. So I checked it out on Blu-ray and watched it last night. And I mean, the scope is hard to not be impressed by. I mean, things that you've already discussed here, there are the number of actors that are in this film is just like mind-boggling. I mean, it's literally just a who's who of major actors in the 70s. The scope of the film, you've got this particular operation being, I mean, how many different storylines or angles, as it were, are there in this film? Like
Yeah,
12,
at
a dozen,
least,
like
yeah.
I mean, you've got in this entire British cast, this entire American cast, you've got this entire German cast, Dutch cast, you've got
Gene Hackman playing a Polish
Hackman
guy
playing a Polish character
who
with
sounds
this accent
Quebecois.
that, with this accent that just, I just want to pause though for a second. And sometimes it's just these funny things that stand out to you in the film, and I'll get back to discussing it proper. But when Gene Hackman pops on, and I have no idea he's going to be playing a Polish character. Matter of fact, until it was mentioned explicitly in the film, I didn't know what he was doing with his voice. Okay,
if he was trying to do British or something.
I had no idea. I had no idea until they actually literally said, called him Polish in the film. But it, to me, I love these moments because I look at Gene Hackman, who clearly is a wonderful actor, has had a fantastic career. And as someone who aspired to be an actor myself, somebody who really prizes good acting, and to see somebody so amazing as Hackman struggle so much with an accent makes me feel so much better. I'm like, thank you.
It's hilarious. It's really good.
It's hilarious, man, because I've got to tell you, of all the nightmares of all the anxious scenarios that might have existed when I was auditioning actively as an actor, the absolute worst for me would be this. I would get an audition and I'd be thrilled, right? Because it's rare to even get asked to audition for something, right? So the first wave of emotion would be, oh my gosh, I can't believe I got an audition. And then I would get the sides, or I'd get the breakdown, whatever information I would available for that particular audition. And the instant I would find out it required an accent, I would just go from joy of having gotten the audition to despair knowing that I couldn't pull off a reasonable accent. Literally the first role I ever booked was a stage role, and I had to have a Spanish accent, and I can't roll my R's. So anyway, it's personal to me. It's personal. That's the point. So watching Gene do this, I felt a nice wave of empathy washed over me.
Just affirmation. Yeah.
And validation. Okay, but back to the film. So yeah, you're just overwhelmed with the scope of it. I thought it was beautifully shot. Obviously it's well acted. I thought this is not, or it's been a while since I've kind of read up on my World War II history, so I kind of had to reacclimate to the, what's going on, what was Market Garden, what were they doing, and why. But I think the film does a really good job of including everything from these huge set pieces. I like the paratroopers is just it's literally 100 or a couple hundred people actually jumping out of C-47s. The scope of that's crazy, all of the World War II accurate hardware is pretty amazing. Although I do have to say, I think there were supposed to be some P-47s in that were clearly not.
They were repainted. I think they were Finnish prop planes or something that they used for training, and they just repainted them. And
most people probably would never notice that, but the Spitfires looked real, but the P-47s were definitely not. But beside the point, who cares? But it, everything from that to these moments, where soldiers at different times have to commandeer civilians' homes, and to see how that affects the civilians, the homes that are taken out from under them, the just random way some people are killed, and kind of the randomness of death, and the surrealness of war, and the bureaucracy that kind of is overwhelming behind a lot of this. I think they did a good job of incorporating all of that. So the scope was huge from a storytelling perspective, from a literal perspective. Was pretty impressive. It's a 3-hour-long film. I do have to admit there were a couple moments where I kind of had to steer my focus back onto it. I started my mind started to wander a little bit. But to be fair, I didn't realize it was going to be 3 hours long, and I started watching it at 10 p.m. So by the time I was through with the film, I was getting a little drowsy.
Yeah.
But overall, in a nutshell, I really enjoyed it. I'm glad that I watched it.
No, I think it does a really good job of, like, it's not a movie that is upfront with gore,
No,
or
it's not
like
gory.
horrific kind of, bloodshed of war, but it's almost, that almost works in its favor, because again it kind of shows this like strange matter of factness that war probably really is like. And it's intensely critical of like bureaucracy, like the bureaucracy of these battles, where, you know it's like, we've got to cross this bridge, but we've got to wait for this traffic jam to clear up on the
Yeah,
one road that we've commandeered, so the boats can get here, and then, but those boats can't get across until we build this other bridge that was destroyed, and those supplies are coming from there. And it does a really good job of like this logistical nightmare that was probably quite accurate to, how it really was. And then again, like you
yeah.
said, that, somebody will be just in a house, and a stray bullet will take them out, and there's not really much attention called to it. It's just kind of like, okay.
Happens. It's just matter of fact.
Yeah. And so it's really, I think it's really fascinating in that way, because when I chose the movie, one of the things that you asked me was, is it like an anti-war film? I think most war films are taken from an angle of like being critical of a lot of things about war. But I think my answer was that it's kind of almost hidden in a way. Like, it's not explicitly anti-war in like a horrific, Saving Private
Yeah.
Ryan, people's arms being blown off and
Yeah, it's
screaming on
not
the
like
beach and stuff.
the war is hell.
Yeah, it's more
Yeah.
just critical of just this kind of, again, this like monotony of the business of like running a war, which is really fascinating, because that's not something that a lot of other war movies really get into at all. And then even again, just this idea that like you get to this very picturesque Dutch village at the beginning, and how for the first, maybe 2 hours, the battle is very much kind of small scale. Like, they get into the city and they're kind of laughing because they're in the wrong camouflage, and there's a few skirmishes on the bridge, but and then suddenly, when the Germans actually launch a counteroffensive, it's like this town is destroyed, and all these civilians that we've gotten to know through the movie are who aren't really necessarily directly related to anything that's going on with the soldiers, but you just see that, like, they're dying, and they're building roadblocks out of the bodies, and all these things.
One of the things that, I want to jump in, because you've kind of reminded me of something that, a few things that really stood out. So the film is, it's almost like you could say these vignettes that are kind of connected, because we're jumping back and forth, from so many different perspectives and so many different angles, and there's such a large cast. I almost feel like it's a series of vignettes in a little bit of a way, but some things that really stand out. Like the home that is like a commandeered, the Dutch home that's like right at the mouth of the bridge or whatever, and one side of the bridge, and it's almost like they use that home and its continual degradation, like its physical degradation as it's attacked, and it's as it is being hit and catches fire, and so you see like this, it's like an interesting barometer of the degradation of the entire area, and then the couple that lives in it, and how they're like, kind of losing their minds, being surrounded by all this violence and having their home taken away from them, to the point where the woman kind of like loses her mind, the civilian woman, and goes outside to like hail a taxi, when there's like, not only is there no taxi, the town is completely evacuated. It's destroyed, and she's shot, just, or I thought it was really touching in the beginning. They set up that, that civilian family with that young boy.
That are kind of like they're acting in the resistance.
Yeah, in a little bit of a sense. And he, is kind of going out on his bicycle and, telling the German guard that he's going to see his girlfriend, when he's actually kind of taking notes of, the insignias on the materiel, and kind of taking note of who's there and whatnot, and how many German soldiers are there. And he kind of comes back to report to his father, and how a little bit into the film he's killed.
Yeah.
And and it's so matter of fact, and I really appreciate how it's not this like in so many movies you'd have like this, you'd zoom in on him, you'd have this like close-up shot, and he'd be like slowly dying in his father's arms, and we'd have this like music swell, and you know what I mean? It'd like really play it up.
Mm-hmm.
But in the scene, I mean, his father picks him up and like puts him on the cart with the pile of the other bodies.
Yeah.
Not that his father isn't devastated. I mean, it's like his father is actually so devastated that this, like, what else can you do? And there's this war going on, and there's all these people dying,
Yeah. Yeah.
But there were a lot of little things like that. I think like the scene where the soldier, like there's like an airdrop, right? And a plane drops like this big steel canister.
Yeah, and the supplies are all going too far.
They're going too far over,
yeah.
right? And so there's like this cylinder, this like steel cylinder is dropped, whatever it is, like 100 yards or something away from where it was supposed to have been. So like this young, strong soldier just kind of decides to take it upon himself to run out there and grab it, right? Well, there's snipers all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
So at first, all of his buddies are like, "Oh my God, you're crazy. What are you doing? You're going to get shot. You're going to get killed. This is nuts." But he like runs out there and he grabs this huge thing, and it's like, can he even lift it? And he actually is able to lift it, and he's actually running back with it. And then, all of the warnings from his fellow soldiers turn into cheers, like, come on, you can do it. It's like you feel this like swell, of excitement and like support. And then he's just shot down.
Yeah.
And it's just like this,
and it's a canister.
And right, and he drops the canister, and it's just berets. It's just filled with hats. It's literally just filled with hats. So meaningless. This kid died for nothing, which of course is a huge part of what war unfortunately is. It's a lot of people dying, usually for not much. But
I just want to add to that one of the interesting things about going there as well in person is that in the house that the British used as their headquarters, that's actually a museum now. And what they did there is
in real life, the house.
Yeah, in real life. Yeah. And in the basement, they like cleared out this massive. They must have excavated a large area, because I doubt the house was built with a basement. But you go underground, and they've actually recreated the streets of Arnhem as they would have been during the battle, with like authentic, like the buildings that you can walk by now, and the bridge and things like that, and with smoke going off and sound effects, and so it's actually quite interesting to. You just reminded me of that in the when you were talking about how like you're just seeing this degradation of this house and things like that, and it's quite fascinating to see it there. But yeah, I also just want to add too about the way that it's matter of fact as well, is that it's not. There's nothing particularly, and I'm not saying this in a negative sense, but there's nothing particularly that calls to itself about like the way that the camera is used, or it's not like there's these crazy sophisticated shots that are like oneers moving through the battle, and it's like, how the hell did they do that? It's quite restrained in the way that it's shot, and I think that really works in its favor, because it doesn't feel so formalistic like perhaps a movie from 10 years earlier would,
right?
Like a big war epic in the 60s, where they can kind of almost just feel like musicals, even if they're not musicals in a way. Like they're just so grand and choreographed, and very clearly most often shot in like studios.
Right.
And yet this is quite formalistic in its style, in terms of the way that it's certainly not like abstract, and yet it really, again, it works in its favor, because it is kind of this exploration of like you said, this just the guy goes out and gets shot for hats, right? Like it's meaningless, but at the same time, it's not this overly dramatized, like after that happens, after the guy gets shot and drops the thing and it opens,
they just cut.
It just shows kind of like not even horror
barely
or like sadness. It's just all the guys that were watching him just kind of die down, or like, oh, like, dang. and
it just goes on to the next thing. Yeah, it just goes on to the next thing. I mean, you're right. It's, the camera doesn't draw attention to itself, but the composition does, in my opinion. Not in a bad way. I don't mean in a bad way. I mean, I think it's really well composed and generally really well shot.
And blocking even just that moment when the guy's walking onto the bridge with the umbrella, and
Mm-hmm.
it kind of pulls back from him and reveals the other soldiers, coming up alongside of him.
Yeah.
Like things like that are, but it's very subtle in its execution, and yet so masterful in the like the way that it's crafted.
Yeah.
Um,
It's almost kind of got this like, there's definitely kind of this 70s kind of dewy, kind of glowy, kind of soft,
mhm, mhm,
kind of thing going on with a lot of it, which, I wouldn't have, I would have expected maybe a little grittier,
mhm.
but in its cinematography, not to say that the film itself doesn't have grit in it, but I just mean, there's, what I'm talking about, right? There's a little bloom, there's a little softness,
Yeah,
there's a
there's definitely some
little,
filters on the camera. The
yeah,
films,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, and which I wouldn't immediately it wouldn't immediately jump to me that would have been a visual style to go
Yeah.
with for a film with this topic, but it I think it works. But there's definitely some moments where it kind of gives it this dreamy kind of quality.
Mhm.
Now, maybe that has to do more with kind of how style has changed in film, and that might not have been the impression it would have given a contemporary audience watching this film. But for me watching it now in 2022, that's a little bit of the feel that it gives me. But overall, I feel like it really was a visually impressive. It's there's a lot for the eyes to look at. It's enjoyable. It's visually interesting and enjoyable film to
Mhm.
watch.
And
Um,
there's a lot of to me like iconic moments, and perhaps just because it was such a big movie in my childhood, but
yeah,
just
like what
where
stands out? Like
like
which scene?
so
Like,
there's these moments that the movie gets very specific and intimate.
mm-hmm,
So I'm thinking about like when they
mm,
commandeer the house that Liv Ullmann lives in with Laurence Olivier,
and they turn it into the like the
and it's like
med
a
unit or
hospital.
the
But
yeah
the
hospital.
way that scene opens is they basically ask her if they can use her house, and she sort of hesitantly agrees because she does
Yeah,
want to help them, but she realizes that this is going to destroy. She's now entering the war essentially, right?
yeah,
But what we see is that they come in, and then we kind of in one shot just pan over to these kids and kind of track over these kids playing with a toy train, and then you just see like a soldier's boot step kind of on the track, and the toy train goes over, and then just blood dribbles
little
down right on
blood
the
drips.
carpet, and then it just
Yeah.
cuts away, and it's very subtle, and
Mm,
it's kind of just like it's this pristine white carpet. These kids are playing, and then suddenly the war is here and has
yeah.
entered the home, and so that, or when um, Gene Hackman and the exiled kind of Polish fighters that had gone to Britain and fled to Britain when Poland was invaded finally get their chance to join the battle because they're delayed in getting there by I think like a matter of almost 8 days or something,
Yeah.
and the operation was supposed to last only 3 or 4. Um, and they finally arrive, and they're pulling the soldiers across the river on this series of ropes and boats that are all connected,
Like
and
pulley system to pull themselves over,
yeah,
right?
and
Yeah.
then without any music or anything, and in a very again matter of fact way, a flare goes up, you hear machine guns, you see some guys get shot in the boats, and then Hackman just looks down at the water, and there's just one body that's kind of wading in ashore, that's dead, of course, and he's just
Mm-hmm.
right in the surf, and I don't know if that's quite the right word, but right just on the edge of the water, and
Yeah.
it just kind of hits, and then it cuts to another scene, and it's like there's all these moments that where while it's such a grand you know and epic in the old sense of the word, and huge movie with all these crazy again
Yeah.
a who's who of cast, and these massive set pieces with real tanks and real military equipment and all that. It does
It
get
still
very
has
intimate
intimate.
at
Yeah.
these moments that need to hit, and I think that's very. And maybe I've never read the script, so I don't know, but William Goldman wrote it, who
Right.
also wrote Butch
Ah,
Cassidy, and
so many great. Yeah.
he has a really really great skill, and so I'm going to assume that it was quite accurate to his script, because, or at least those things were, because in Butch Cassidy, one of the things that I mentioned in that episode was that there's the moment where the movie's quite lighthearted throughout, and then when they kill the banditos, and it's the first time that Butch Cassidy has shot anybody and killed anybody, and suddenly the movie just has this like very very dour tone for a moment, and it's very
Mm,
again very intense for just a scene, that and it doesn't
yeah.
feel out of place. So Goldman, I think, is very good at writing things like that, and they're all over this movie, and it's one of those things again that just is very impressive to me. And, at the end of the day as well, what I think differentiates this from a lot of other war movies is that they're ultimately not really successful. There's kind
Yeah.
of the again, bureaucratic moment at the end where he's like, well, the mission was 90% a success, but it wasn't.
successful. Yeah.
They had heavy losses. They completely underestimated the German position. They had to retreat. They had to pull out of where they were trying to hold. And so it does, I think, ultimately criticize a lot of these elements that aren't usually really touched upon, especially back in that era of film where
well, I think it's like
movies were
in
big
the
and,
60s you would have 50s, 60s, at least the United States, you'd have films generally that of course were super patriotic, and they would praise the all, there wouldn't be any criticism hardly at all of the war, right? Then you get into the 70s, and of course the new Hollywood, right? In the United States, I mean, you hardly had like a happy ending in any story in the 70s, in American cinema. And so you do, now this is of course a British film though, but I just mean kind of the zeitgeist of film in general, where you could have anti-heroes, you could have, kind of cynical stories, you could have,
failure without
quote unquote
resolution.
unhappy endings, you could be critical of governments and critical of war, and you've got Vietnam happening here, and of course that impacted the world, not just the United States, and you've got a lot of criticism about these things that didn't exist culturally or in cinema, and so I mean, this film isn't as like directly or explicitly critical like a lot of films would be, especially later, that were just outright full on, explicitly critical of war and
like a Thin Red Line or something,
or Platoon, or, so it's not that, but it definitely, but you don't have to read between the lines much either to really see that they're kind of, they're picking apart the bureaucracy, the senseless death that occurs, and kind of the randomness that death can occur, and just how the death can be really meaningless, frankly, in war, so much of it. And I think they definitely, that's a big part of this film.
Yeah. And I think even just the ending, like, the final shot of it doesn't end on a field of graves. It doesn't end on a, return to Belgium, where the Allies have their kind of foothold in Northern Europe, and they're all like, the troops are like, well, we're going to go back out and get it. No, it ends with this Dutch family leaving their house and walking along this kind of tattered road with smoke and rubble around them. Yeah. And it just kind of, ends like that. And it's funny too, because when we did Alien a few episodes ago, I said that if there was ever like if someone, was like, here's $50 million and you get to make any franchise movie you want, what franchise would you choose? I would choose Alien. If somebody said, here's $50 million but you have to remake a movie and update it for modern, like, modern times, and you have to make it, technology today, it would absolutely be this. And I wouldn't, not in a sense that I believe that this movie needs a remake, by no means, but I think that it would be it's such a fascinating,
boy, there'd be a lot of CGI if you made it today for $50 million.
I know, that's the thing, right? You'd have to have, for $50 million, absolutely. You wouldn't get the cast back either.
And what cast? Yeah, I mean, you might get like two actors.
I'd get George Clooney and that's it. But just the idea, like, Market Garden has always been something that's really one of my, I think in terms of the Western Front of the European theater in World War II, the Battle of the Bulge tends to be my favorite moment, which was just after this. It would have been December of 44. But in terms of, the Market Garden has always been up there, just because it was really just a prime example of like how these young 18-year-olds are like chess pieces to a lot of these upper, the upper strategists of the war. And that, like, there's the one general at the beginning of the movie who's constantly trying to, warn them that there's like tanks, and Rommel is there, and they're like, well, why would or Model, not Rommel.
Right. Correct.
Field Marshal Model, who's a German. He's there, and it's like, well, they wouldn't put him there if they didn't have, a lot of troops, and they're like, no, they're just going to be a bunch of Hitler youth and old people that are going to fight us. It's going to be easy. And even when faced with like this mounting evidence, that they still kind of go ahead and it's all just, it's about like, it's not about getting through with lives, as few lives lost as possible. It's just about getting through and establishing a foothold and
Yeah.
And they really kind of drive that point home.
Just how big of a machine war is, just how
it's like a big corporation.
Yeah. I mean, it's just this huge machine, and oftentimes, sadly, I mean, the machine grinds up, young men and now women, but and the impact it has on civilians, and I mean, I when the film first started, for a second, I thought, oh, this is going to be kind of one of those, films that's really about the glory and the, and the action of war. And so I was surprised to see that there was much more than that. So yeah, because like it's marketing, I kind of like, I see the poster, and, I'm like, oh, I look at all these people, and I'm like, oh, this is going to be like kind of a John Wayne-y kind of action war movie, is kind of what I was thinking. And there is definitely a lot of action, but it is more.
I do. We've kind of been doing this throughout, but I do also want to, like, just for a moment, also sort of like, again, compare it to. There's kind of this spectrum of like war movies from, like, again, on the far end, I'd say like The Thin Red Line, which is barely even a war film. It's
Apocalypse Now.
More of or Apocalypse Now, where it's like it's using the setting of war to say something much grander about, humanity and life and things like that. And then on the complete opposite end, you get something, like, say, like The Longest Day, where it's very, again, full of like glory and like sacrifice and patriotism.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's like the modern trend of the Saving Private Ryans, the shaky cam and things like that. And I like Saving Private Ryan. It's not.
I do too. I do too.
But it did start this trend, right?
But here's one. Here's an even newer one, like a film like Midway. And I don't know if you've seen that, but that's not that long ago. This is 2019, and I mean, it's like a full-on Disney war movie.
Tons of like CG and
CG, and like Pearl Harbor. Didn't Bruckheimer
exactly,
make that?
exactly, yeah.
Those are the films that are on the far side of,
and I think
almost like glamorizing war. It's like
I honestly expected it same as you. I expected it to be like that.
Yeah,
because I hadn't seen it in so long, right? Like I expected to sit down and watch this and be like, because I remembered the plot and I remembered a lot of things about it, but I just didn't really remember the movie as a whole. And so I was really pleasantly surprised to see that it wasn't that.
Yeah.
And I think, I mean, there's this very interesting, like, I would say, for people who haven't seen it, who are listening, I'd honestly, is in sort of feeling and mood and tone, it's oddly similar to Dunkirk in a way, where Dunkirk is another one of those movies that doesn't really glorify anything about war, and it's very matter of fact, and death is dealt in a very matter of fact way, but there's not a lot of gore.
Right.
It's very massive in scale. Gratuitous. There's like these real plane battles and battleships, and it's not a lot of CG. And so I'd say that if you enjoyed Dunkirk, perhaps I would recommend checking this out, because this is not in, it's Dunkirk doesn't have an all-star cast of 1,000,001 celebrities. But I would say that
it's got a few.
Tonally, it's kind of got the same like thesis as Dunkirk, of just this kind of like bureaucratic wastefulness of because of course Dunkirk was also somewhat of a similar operation in a way, of just this like massive mobilization to get a bunch of people out of a situation that they'd accidentally got themselves in.
Hey, let's not forget though. Harry Styles is in Dunkirk.
That's true. That's a good point. Yes.
I mean,
we
come
had
on.
the One Direction representation there.
I mean, like, isn't that all the star power you need?
I heard that when Christopher Nolan was casting that, he didn't even know that Harry Styles was like famous at all.
I don't think I knew who Harry Styles was in 2017.
I barely did.
It's just not my. I will say though, not to digress too far, but that is Nolan's best film.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I'm not a huge. I like Nolan.
I'm not
appreciate him as a
Nolan
filmmaker,
fan.
But I'm not. I don't really love any of his movies.
I appreciate him.
Mm-hmm,
I appreciate him. Obviously, he's passionate about filmmaking, and I think that I will always welcome. Into the community. He makes all kinds of different people, right? And he's clearly passionate about filmmaking, and I think's given a lot of visibility to cinema, and so that's wonderful.
Yeah,
but I a lot of his films I'm not super crazy about, but this film was great, and I think your comparison to these two films is an interesting one, because Dunkirk is kind of the same situation. It's picking one kind of specific moment of a larger war. So this is like the evacuation of Dunkirk. Of course, in Bridge Too Far, it's specifically the Operation Market Garden. And taking one of those elements and kind of, looking at it from all of these different perspectives. There are many more perspectives in Bridge Too Far, because we're looking at it from multiple different, armies and, even,
sides.
But Dunkirk still has a little bit of that. We're looking at it from these different soldiers' perspectives. We're seeing kind of the same moments go by from all of these different perspectives. So I think that's a really good, it's a good comparison. And I think you're right. I mean, I think if anybody had seen Dunkirk and you liked it at all, there's probably a good chance that you would like Bridge Too Far.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I wish that they had, sometimes it's a little bit heartbreaking. I wish that there were more care given to these films in their taking them to modern media or
restorations and
pseudo modern media. Blu-ray is not exactly modern. It's a pretty old. I mean, I think we're sitting at Blu-rays are like 15 years old now, right?
Yeah.
So it's not even brought to 4K. But yeah, and I get it. There's not a lot of money to do that. But the copy that I had was like middling. It wasn't horrible, but it wasn't great.
Yeah, it's not a great scan. Same with me.
Now, how did you see it? Did you stream it? Did you have a copy? Or
my dad owns the version I would have watched, so I streamed it instead. Yeah. Interestingly, I streamed it, and it was, for some reason, the German subtitles weren't working, like in terms of the moments where the Germans are speaking. So I just had to basically go from memory of what they're talking. And there are, honestly, it was weirdly easy.
Did you remember?
It came back. Yeah, like when it's like flatten Arnhem and all that. When they refuse the surrender and all that. That's also, I love that scene when he's like, we'd love to take you in, but we don't have the facilities to take you in surrender. That's a great bit. But I do also...
And there's some humor. We haven't talked about that, but this is an example of that. There is some humor there. So,
but it's not like gags. It's just that there's this kind of, there's these moments where, again, it probably the same type of humor that you'd probably have in a real conflict like this, right? Where it's like... tell them to go to hell, and then they, the Germans are asking the British if they want to surrender, and then the British respond by saying that they can't really accept the German surrender at this time. So things like that are really, and I think that's one other thing that this movie does that a lot of war movies miss out on. Just before I move on to the next point, is that it's so fast. I remember as a kid being so fascinated by the fact that you could have like one of the majors in the British Army, be transported to the German HQ to have a conversation with the German general while the fighting is still going, and all these things where it's like, you really get a sense of the kind of odd bureaucracy of war.
Yeah, it's kind of surreal, you know. Yeah, I agree.
And then they'll go back 2 minutes later to killing each other, right? It's so it's fascinating. But I want to mention the score.
Yeah.
So John Addison, I think I mentioned this at the beginning, but John Addison fought in the real, who was the composer of the soundtrack, fought in Operation Market Garden.
Okay.
And I love the score for that. Like, this is hands down one of my favorite soundtracks to a movie.
Yeah, he was a colonel in the Royal Field, Artillery.
Yeah. And I'm surprised that he didn't have more of a successful career as a composer. He did,
Oh, I got that
movies.
wrong. Let me correct myself. That was his father. So he came from the military. I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but I want to correct myself so that I don't have an erroneous piece of info here. No, his father was a colonel in the Royal Field Artillery, but you're right. So he was actually a tank officer, and he served at the Battle of Normandy, and then, like you said, in Operation Market Garden. Okay, yeah, wow.
Yeah, and so I'm surprised, but again, this score is very. I think I never noticed this as a kid. Obviously, I wasn't analyzing it, but I think last night was the first time that I really noticed when I was watching this how the score begins as this kind of triumphant military march with the snare drums and the brass and all that.
Kind of typical.
But there's also this. Yeah. Then it gets into this kind of tinge of like melancholy. And there's like even when it's very sweeping and big and kind of boisterous, there still is this like it's all primarily in a major key, but there's almost this like element where it's kind of leans into a minor at points and
kind of more somber.
And even in like that main theme, it's very, I don't know, something about this score when you listen to this theme song just fits so perfectly with the subject matter of the film. That and it's such a catchy
intriguing.
Tune.
and it's so rare. I mean, I can't think of another film. I'm sure maybe it's happened before, but I can't think of it where the composer was actually present
for the events
in real life, in the and active in the real life events that the film is depicting. I mean, that's got to be exceedingly rare, I would imagine. And so
I can't think of another example of that.
I can't either. And so, gosh, I mean, I can only fathom, as you would be composing music, to have actually lived that and to have those memories that you could draw upon. And I mean, that's got to bring a richness to that creation of that soundtrack that just adds a different layer, for sure. That's pretty extraordinary, and I didn't know that when I watched the film, so I didn't only learn that in our discussions here, but that's extremely interesting. Wow,
yeah, and it makes you kind of. I wonder how he, if he had any like input on the film otherwise, if they asked him any questions about it, or if it was just he was. Yeah, I'm not sure.
I wonder.
And it's the other interesting thing about the movie is even with its all-star cast, it didn't perform that well. So
no,
it was a success in Europe. It did well in Europe, but in North America, it didn't do very well. The reviews were positive, but not.
Yeah, it wasn't. It's like kind of half and half. Yeah.
And I honestly think one of the reasons that may be is that it came out a month after Star Wars. And so obviously Star Wars had ushered in this new era of like huge spectacle science fiction, and I wouldn't honestly be surprised if a lot of audiences were just like, who cares? Like, who cares about this old fart war movie?
Yeah, that's true, because the film does harken back to an older era, I think, of storytelling. And we're talking about a World War II film, a film that is about something that happened in 1944 specifically, and here we are in 1977. And you said Star Wars was released just a couple months.
May of 1977, yeah. So I think this came out in the end of June of 1977.
So it would have Star Wars would have still been tearing it up in theaters at this point, because films actually, I know if you're for our younger audience out there, films used to last longer in theaters than just like a week.
They could
or
be
two.
out for over a year.
They could actually be out. And Star Wars was probably in theaters for a year if you count everywhere. But yeah, I mean, Star Wars would have still been probably eaten up a lot of box office at that point.
Definitely. Yeah.
So you wouldn't have, you might not have for several different reasons. You might not have as large an audience, perhaps, for such an expensive film. And let's also too, let's face it, a 3-hour runtime, you've got a lot less screenings that can take place in a day.
Yeah.
So, and I might have this wrong, and maybe if you know, you can help me. But wasn't this privately financed?
Let's see. So it was produced by Levine. It was because it was I think. Did United Artists? No, United Artists just bought the distribution.
Yes, so that might be.
John E. Levine Productions was the production company.
Yeah, so I think it was privately financed, and so and I don't know a ton about Joseph Levine to kind of I'm not sure what his production history was, what films he had produced before or after this, but or even where the money came from for this film, but it's surprising that a film with this many stars, with this much commercial potential, would even be allowed to be 3 hours long.
And without not that intermissions were huge in the 70s, but for longer movies it was quite common to see them even then. So I'm surprised
you get yourself like an old-fashioned roadshow showing. I'm trying to think. The last film that I saw like a roadshow would have been Tarantino's Hateful Eight. I went to go see that. I saw 70, that in 70 millimeter, actually projected in film, and they had a roadshow, and it was really fun. That was cool
with the the overture and all that.
I love that. I love like it's like you kind of set the mood. You have like a brief overture. You're kind of like let the music wash over you, and
feels more like an event, right?
Yeah, and you're getting excited. Like your imagination starts to run wild. Like how's it gonna open? What's the story? It's like I love that. I love like it helps with the immersion, and because let's be honest, it's like you need a palate cleanser after all these commercials and the stupid trivia shows that they have at theaters now. And it's like all this crap, and it's like you've got the like talking heads that are
interviewing about the next big Disney film or something.
Yeah. And it's like, hey, let's talk about whatever Frozen 5, and it's all this like super markety, super pitchy stuff. And then, if you're going in to watch like this somber war movie or something, and it just cuts right into it. It's like, I feel like you need a palate cleanser.
You need to see, you need to get in the mood, right? I think that's the shame about this movie is that, I love it a lot. And I would love to see a restoration of it.
I'd love to see a good restoration. I think it's ripe. Yeah. I think it would be ripe for a high quality restoration, a 4K release, even if they didn't do a physical media, they could do it justice for streaming.
They likely would. I mean, it's not the most famous movie in the world, even though there's 1 million stars in it.
I'm, like I said, I mean, and here I am, I had never seen it, and I may have heard of it, and I just am not remembering. But I can't even recall really having heard much about this film at all. So it, there you go. But it's, I don't control these things. If I could wave a magic wand. Which is, exactly. I'm not saying that it looked horrible. But
that glowy sort of like hazy, very 60s, 70s look that was applied to a lot of movies back then. Does not look good in less like subpar resolution. Because it winds up just kind of muddying the image, whereas I'm sure projected on film it looks incredible. But that kind of softer look is always it's always going to look rougher in a less well done transfer.
For sure. Well, we didn't talk about this, but I kind of want to bring it up because it was one of the things that stood out to me. Now, it won a handful of BAFTAs. It didn't win any awards here in the United States, but it won a handful of BAFTAs. And one of the BAFTAs it won was for sound design. Now, it's fun for me, and I was just like talking to my wife like a few days ago, and I was kind of explaining why I so much love watching older films. And I was kind of thinking about it, and I was explaining it to her, and kind of my articulation of that. In part, it's that I think they made better films back then, but also it's like the closest that we've got to time travel. Now, in a couple different ways. If you're a cinephile, if you love cinema, one of the ways that it's kind of like time travel is that you can go back and you can look at the state of the art as it was when it, so in this case in 77. So you're going back and you can see like what was the grammar of film like? What was, how were they using technology to tell stories? And there, if you really watch these older films, you'll notice that there are some pretty significant differences in expectations that modern audiences have for the stories that they're told and how they're told, as opposed to in the 70s, for example. It's also interesting too because it's like time travel. You can go back and you can see a young Robert Redford, and you can see, and it's like, it's just really beautiful to me. It's one of the many reasons why I so love cinema. But one of the things that stood out to me in a funny way about this film were aspects of its sound design. I thought was especially interesting because this actually, was noted and honored for its sound design. And you'd said that you noticed it too. It's like you'll have these really wide, the camera will be really wide, and we'll be seeing this like entire, battle going on, and this large scale and scope, and there are many soldiers fighting, and then all of a sudden you'll hear, as if the person were like right in your face, like like a dying sound.
Yeah.
And it sounds like so like stock sound, like you can so tell, like the ADR is just like, it's like there was an actor standing like 6 inches away from a microphone
just
going,
doing a bunch of noise. Yeah. At least I don't think there's any use of the Wilhelm scream in this.
No, I didn't hear
it. At least
it.
it doesn't lose points on that. But
No. It doesn't. There's that's true. But and you had even mentioned too, right? There's like that scene where there's, it's help me.
After the crossing in the boats, and then there's just this pan of all the bodies on the shore of the beach, and
but we're probably
like 100 feet away. Yeah,
we're like 100 yards away from the action, right? It's like this wide shot, but anyway, I kind of joke. I don't mean to poke too much fun at the film,
and there are moments that do sound. I think all the military, in terms of like the weaponry and the scope of the sound design of that sort of stuff sounds quite good. It
sounds really good, and that's often a giveaway too, because boy, so this is another kind of fun thing about grammar of cinema and technology of cinema. You go back to especially a decade before this, and every single bullet sound is like pew pew pew. Especially if you go back to spaghetti westerns and every single gunfire sounds like that. So definitely the film does not contain that kind of stuff. So you're right. I mean, I think a lot of the battles did have good sound design, but just that the kind of like ignoring the spatial relationship of what we're seeing on screen and what we're hearing in our ears. Now maybe that was actually, maybe that's like a mastering issue.
It could have been, or it could have just been a challenge in terms of the like analog.
I'm sure it was ability. A mono track.
Yeah.
I'm sure it was a mono optical track on the film, and so who knows what happened to that after the fact. So to be fair, I can't actually blame that on the film. That could have been something to do with how they remastered the sound and presented it on the Blu-ray that I had. And setups can be so different that it even could be, the type of amplifier I have and my speaker setup and all this kind of jazz. So it is a little bit of a funny.
Mostly
it was just a funny story, and it gave me a chance to kind of share one of my reasons that I love cinema and my kind of like my little time traveling theory there. But
just before we wrap up, too, I want to add that my favorite. I forgot to mention this earlier, but my favorite gag in the movie. There's a lot, and there's a few of them. Again, not gag in terms of like slapstick, but my favorite joke is when right after the planes all take off and we cut to this church service, and the church service is going on, the choir's singing, and everyone's like in the church, and then suddenly you hear this rumbling of all these hundreds and hundreds of planes going overhead. And it's like everyone just sort of fizzles out the song and looks up, and it's just this really great bit, I think, of again, the movie does have this sense of humor in these little moments. So I always thought that was
it does. And and they're kind of visual, like you just described. They're these kind of like nice kind of like lighter visual moments, or even kind of multi-layered. I would agree. It was a very interesting film, and Cullen, I'm really glad that you shared it with me. I wouldn't have. wouldn't have seen it probably had it not been for your bringing it to my attention here for this
No,
episode. So I appreciate that. Hopefully, I can return the favor with my selection next time, which I haven't quite decided on, but I will soon.
No,
So,
I'm glad that it was. I'm glad it was good. I'm glad that after all these years, it held up.
you know, one of
Yeah.
these days, dude, and we haven't done it yet, but seriously, I mean, if for people who've listened to every or most of our episodes, and of course you and I know this to be true, I mean, we have actually never done a film where either one of us, much less both of us, were like, you know what, that sucked. This was
Yeah.
a horrible movie, and we're
should
going to
try
talk
that.
for an hour. And we're going to talk for an hour about why it sucked. We've never done that, and I'm like, I've been halfway tempted.
Maybe our 100th episode.
I've been halfway tempted, but I'm like, that seems so mean to like purposely pick a bad film. But you really can learn a lot from a bad film, and
Oh yeah.
there and there are a lot of films that a lot of people love that I think are horrible, and vice versa. So it's subjective, and it's kind of fun to dissect that and to kind of learn from that. So who knows? I mean, maybe, but it would be interesting. Or if we picked a film that like I loved, for example, and you thought was garbage, or vice versa, that might be interesting. But we'll have to see. We'll have to see. Maybe I'll start to get like more, experimental and out there in my choices. Who knows?
Yes.
Find out.
Oh, I've
Tune
got
in
some
next
ideas.
time. Tune in next time, viewers. But seriously, everybody, thanks for hanging in there with us. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Soldiers of Cinema. Until next time, we wish you adieu.
Bye bye.